Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Blake, and this is Kyle and Doug, and we are pastors at Living Springs Church. And every week we love answering your questions and just exploring this wonderful faith we have. And we're all talking before we start today that this is free in a world of where everything costs a lot right now. You can listen to us for free.
And it seems to be going to be costing more in the next little while.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Not going down.
Crazy times in the world that we live in.
So there is advantages to listening to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast.
There, you may be listening to this way in the future, and I don't know what things are like. That I actually ran into somebody from the church this week at Costco.
I thought you were going to say you ran into someone from the future, and I was getting really excited for a second.
That's a whole other podcast. But I ran into somebody at Costco this week, and they're like, "Hey, I was just listening to you." They were on episode 10 of the Q&A podcast.
No, wow.
Yeah, they've listened to everything in the last year, and then they went back and started from the beginning.
Episode
and
10.
we're at episode 10. I'm like, I apologize for the audio quality.
Oh, yeah. That'd be, and they're okay with it? Like, if you started with the last year, then you went back to that. That was when we used to throw one mic in the middle of a table.
Yep.
And then force everybody to sit relative
to
distance to the mic based on how loud they were.
Correct. That was before you were on staff. So
yeah, totally.
Episode 10 would be right when we started this podcast, obviously, which we're, 6 years in now? So you're no more than that.
No, more than that. We're like 8 or 9 years in.
Yeah, so you're 2017 or something like that.
I'd like to know what podcast I joined you in. Like, what was my first podcast? I should go back and have a look. Yeah.
There you are. But yeah, so you may be listening to this, and maybe the economy solved itself by the time you're listening to this podcast.
You would have to
and our
actually...
gripes are aged.
That's right. You would have to actually listen to every podcast because we didn't label who was on every week.
No, but you
back
could listen
then we
to
had
like every 10 and then kind of like sort it out or
but
something.
we would have just whatever staff person wanted to be.
Yeah.
Like
there were
on that
like
week.
7 of us on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are they dated at all? I haven't looked like...
Oh, they're very
every
dated.
podcast. Every podcast publisher will list when it was posted. Yeah.
Okay, because I started in the fall of 2018.
Yeah.
So that would give a better shot.
Yeah.
anyways.
On all the different platforms, it'll have when they were posted.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you are.
So,
But with that said, we get into our questions for this week.
All right. Well, our first question is actually grouped with the question we ended off with last week, and we said that we were going to talk about tithing, and we didn't. But this next question talks about tithing as well, so we'll just jump into that question, and I think that will
Cover both.
Sure.
wait. I think I should read the question since it's addressed to you.
All right.
In relation to Blake's sermon this weekend, it wasn't this past weekend, but we got the question after you preached the sermon during our 7 Deadly Sins series.
And we're almost done our next series.
And we're almost done our next series. So this question's been there for a while.
Yeah.
But in relation to Blake's sermon this weekend on greed and his references to tithing, it made me wonder. If someone is tithing the traditional 10%, whether it should be on gross or net income, I would imagine most people would do it on net income. But wouldn't that mean that our first fruits are going to the government and not God? Or does that not matter, since that is not money we have any control over, and first fruits would be more in relation to what we do with the funds we actually receive or control? Not looking to be dogmatic on it, just curious about what you guys think.
So I do have an experience with this answer, and I think you did a very good job, whoever wrote the question, of like answering your own question, really, because I think all those things are relevant. But I remember early in our years of being friends, I can't remember why we were talking about tithing. You did my taxes for a little bit, Doug. So at some point, I don't know, in conversation it came up, you're like, oh, you tithe on your net income. And then we discussed that, because I'd never even thought about tithing on the gross, because it was just the money that I got. We got physical checks back in those days.
You're old. So, Kyle, a check was a piece of paper that you used to get.
Not that young.
So I would tithe on that, the net portion. But then you had said that's not really what you're making. You're making the gross. So I did. I changed how I tithed at that point. So there you go. I don't know if I have an opinion today that's dogmatic, as the question says, but that was my personal choice at that time. We've opinion.
covered tithing on the podcast a couple times. So I don't mind jumping into the conversation and saying that tithing is not a New Testament principle. That is an Old Testament Israelite principle.
Yep.
It is not something bad to live by. I will make that clear off the beginning. But the New Testament begins with everybody selling everything that they own and giving all of it to the church and entrusting that all who had need would be provided for through that shared fund. And then Paul references that God loves a cheerful giver without referencing any certain amount. There is a much deeper picture in the New Testament than a specific amount that is tithing. I think that shows the contrast that is often happening, though the laws of the Old Testament were aiming to draw people's hearts along with a specific practice, really setting the bare minimum, as I think Jesus would say. You've heard it said, but I say to you, and he deepens the matters. The tithe was a functional economy for the Levites who wouldn't have had anything to say. We need to make sure to cover them, and so making sure that there was enough for them by that 10% being given, but also a practice of the first fruits in an agrarian society. Versus the New Testament is not as narrowly prescriptive. I think in a way of hoping actually to draw from your heart more than a rigidness that is there. And so the New Testament doesn't have that prescription. And so the generosity that is given, I think, is what God's looking for as we get into that. But that should be something that's growing. But 10%, in whatever way you define it, is not going to be a bad way of living.
So this is a topic that actually my thinking on has evolved and changed a lot since we had that conversation. I grew up in a Pentecostal church where you tithed, and you tithed on the gross. And the reason you tithed on the gross was because that money went to the government, which provided services that you enjoyed. So you could debate how effective the government was with that money, and that's a different conversation. And we have talked about government, and we have talked about democracy and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, just lately
but
even.
At the end of the day, there was this recognition that your health care, your education, your infrastructure, all of these things were actually the result that you were receiving the benefit of from your income. Mm-hmm. So it went to the government. From that money, the government provided these services. So you tithed on your gross. And so that would have been what I would have said to you all those years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I would echo what you say at this point, Kyle, that like my thinking on Old Testament law has changed. The book, The Lost World of the Law, was that the Torah?
The Lost World of Torah.
The Torah, yeah. Just really helped reshape my thinking about how we view the law in the Old Testament much differently than they would have. We view it in the context of an English common law. We've talked about this in the past as well. But also just when I think about the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and I think about Joshua 1, where God instructs Joshua to meditate on the law, and Psalm 1, where there's this blessing that's for those who meditate on the law, that the law was not this, okay, do this thing, but it was meant to be, here's something to chew on to help guide you into a better way of living. And the idea of generosity being that. And so I would agree with what you're saying, that Jesus, the heart of God, even in the Old Testament before it was revealed in Christ, would have been, take this idea of tithing that is law and does have a function in that society for the Levites, but take that and now think about it and meditate on it and chew on it and let it be what leads you into this generous life.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I have to recant what I said to you all those years ago.
Well, not really. If you were instructing somebody on tithing, you could still say those things. Like that hasn't changed. If you wanted to tithe and you wanted to do it in the Old Testament way, then you would probably recommend they do it on the gross, right? But if you're talking about giving in general to the church, you might not direct them to tithe as the first principle.
Well, I wouldn't encourage anyone to tithe according to the Old Testament way anymore. That would be where things would be different.
Yeah.
I would say you're not Jewish. So let's have a different conversation. Not that we ignore the Old Testament, but what is the heart that God's trying to express in that we understand more fully through Christ and his teaching and the way that he leads us in. So
I appreciate you bringing in the conversation around the government providing services as well as a part of that, because I think we forget that is also part of the picture that was being painted for Israel. The temple would have been not just a place of religious worship,
Yes.
but the center for all of society. And so those who had
100%.
need would have gone to the temple and had those needs provided for. So they were in a lot of ways also a social infrastructure for Israel, while also being a religious infrastructure. And so it wasn't just
I can
providing for that.
assume as you say that, then,
Yeah.
like most people have worked in a scenario where you get your paycheck and everyone gets their paycheck and says to each other, "Man, I hate taxes. They steal all my money. Like government, blah blah blah."
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many Israelites walked around like, "I hate tithing. Goes to the stupid temple. I earned that money. I did my work. Why do they take all my money?" I'm sure it would be the same.
Well, we know that's
thing,
there because
right?
the prophets critiqued the priests at certain points, right? Of how they were living in luxury and living in abundance because they were abusing that system. Like,
Human nature has not changed.
Yes.
you've got humans in power as the source of the entrustment of what's supposed to be collective. They're going to abuse it.
Yeah.
So that did happen for sure. Yeah.
We often read the Old Testament, we're like, oh, those silly Jews.
Yeah.
And then we read the Gospels, we're like, oh, those silly Pharisees. Like, those people were so dumb and they missed it so much. And
But not us. We get it right.
What I can't remember the Ken Shigematsu book that you and I read together.
God in my everything.
God in my everything. There was two. I think there's a chapter on generosity or something in that book. Like it was a trellis.
Yes,
system, right?
100%. Because he talks, it's basically a rule of life.
Yeah.
It was the first book I ever read on this idea of a rule of life that covered all the main things, and money was one of them. Yes.
So there was two things I think I remember from that book, and I haven't read in a long time. One was he said there was some survey or stats on when a person like humanity, because they did survey, would feel comfortable giving away 10% of their income.
Right.
And it was like, I think once they reached $1.2 million in income or something like that, a yearly income. It was over $1 million. I remember that. Before a normal human being would be like 10%, I can give that much away.
Yeah.
So that made me think about tithing and thinking like tithe is huge, right? And then also he talked about a group of friends that he had. He's from the Vancouver area. They probably lived out there, that had dedicated themselves to living in such a way that they would give enough away that they would always feel the strain of it. So on whatever income they
live by
got.
faith.
Yeah. And those two things have always sat in my mind. Like even as you were talking about 10% and Jesus saying maybe it's more, like most people are uncomfortable with giving 10% of their income. So if you're going to go from an Old Testament to a New Testament principle, you don't really get off the hook. Right? It's actually probably going to cost you more.
Yeah.
But I also think we look at that and we're like, 10%, like that's crazy. It would have been so different back then, but it wouldn't. Like 10% of what you had was still 10% of what you had.
Yeah.
And I always think, like I remember a number of years ago, there was someone who was attending the church and they were talking to me about how, they had come out of some different churches where they saw some real, what they felt were abuse of the finances, that they weren't being handled well, that had caused them to stop giving. And they were like, but I feel like God is convicting me to do that again, and I'm not sure what to do. And I said, well, like they said, I'm not ready to do 10%. And I was like, okay, what would be a step of faith?
Mm-hmm.
Because everything we're called to do is by faith.
That's very
and
true.
this is where, for me, as I talk about my thinking on this evolving, is we can approach the idea of tithing not from faith, but from law.
Yeah.
And we don't live by law, we live by grace.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at it and we could be like, well, yes, for some people, tithing requires no faith at all, right? But for somebody else, giving 1% or 2% would require great faith. And so I was like, what would a giving by faith look like for this person? And that was just kind of where I felt like to challenge this person. And I'm not saying that is universal to all of these questions. When I think about last week's question with regards to giving, with regards to the giving in the debt, I think that's a part of that conversation, but there's also a part of that conversation that we had last week that has to just acknowledge spending habits and lifestyle. Because if I'm living in a way that is beyond my income, and then I'm going, okay, wait a minute, if I start tithing, then God's going to provide for all of my needs, that's not going to work. You can't just claim that as a thing and God's obligated now to give you all of the money that you require for whatever lifestyle you've decided that you warrant.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a bigger conversation there. I believe where the Bible talks about God providing, God taking care of our needs. But I also believe we sometimes struggle with recognizing what is a need and what is a want. So I just think that we have to live in all areas by faith. And so for this person, it was like, what would be a step of faith for you? And at that point, they were like, 2% would be a step of faith. I was like, okay, then do that, right? And see where it goes. And it just started a journey for this person that they kind of entered into this. And I do think, like, I want to say it's in Galatians, where Paul says, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself through love.
Yeah, chapter 5.
Yeah, the only thing that matters is that we have this active faith in God that we are growing in and learning that causes us to love more fully God and others. And I look at that and I'm like, that includes our finances.
Absolutely.
Right?
Does.
When it comes to your finances, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself through love.
Yep.
So I think that is a better way to look at the concept of finances than the Old Testament principle of tithing.
Yep. Which we talked about generosity as well last week, which I think fits in as well.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a reason why Jesus says this is like a heart issue, why he like puts it right up there, right?
Yep.
Like where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
Well, Jesus never said, like, a man can't serve two masters. You'll serve either God or cabbage. You'll serve either God or, some random thing. Because most of those wouldn't be trouble. Like, okay, I'll serve God.
Yeah.
He picked the thing that we will struggle with, right? Martin Luther said, the Christian goes through usually 3 conversions: the conversion of the mind, the conversion of the heart, and then the conversion of the wallet.
Yeah, that probably makes sense. I say that because we talked about generosity with the young adults.
Cool.
And there's a couple, my own son, who is just like, he can't even turn right or left without talking about money lately through the conviction of what we've talked about, right? Like, he's like, well, as a church, I read the Bible, or like, and he's justifying every way that he can possibly try to justify that he doesn't have to give, but like he's harder on himself than anybody else is, right?
Right.
And then I think, I preach a sermon on generosity and, we get a couple of questions from it. Like this does hit us where it hurts a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, well, we jump on to the next question.
I think so.
Okay. It says, I just finished reading Galatians with my teenage children, and they would like to know why God picked circumcision as a symbol for being set apart as his people in the Old Testament. Do you have any explanations?
I love this question.
It's so honest.
It's fantastic.
It's like all the things you could pick, God. Why that?
So, I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah.
I do. Sure, I can jump in.
So jump in. Start.
So we first get mention of circumcision with Abram as the founder or the patriarch of Israel.
Can I just interrupt for 1 second?
Yep.
So I want to say it was recently when I was reading a commentary on the book of Romans
Yeah.
that they talked about how Paul in Romans just calls him Abraham, even when he's referencing things before his name change.
Yeah.
And I've always struggled with that.
Right.
And I was like, if Paul can do it, so can we. And so it's okay. You can just say Abraham.
I would just like to recognize both because at certain
but
point,
Paul didn't.
there's a lot of stuff that Paul does that most people exegeting now would be uncomfortable with.
Yes, but I'm just like, that's a regular thing because I've wrestled with that when I preach to try and keep it in my mind when the name change happened and whether you're using the right name. And I always struggled with that. So I'm just trying to give you
some freedom.
That's good.
Freedom, Kyle. You got your freedom to just say whatever you want to say.
Fair. As God first asked Abraham to mark himself and the later generations with this symbol, it comes right on the heels of kind of the last resolution that we see of Hagar and Ishmael. I've heard some people comment and tie together. That's not mistaken. So God's promise to Abraham to make a great nation of him, and they're doing that by a multiplication of his people and his offspring, is tied to also a consequence of how he had tried to do that on his own with Hagar, where though the Bible doesn't use this clear of language, and I think I've heard some pastors and some people speaking out of it kind of dance around it, but what Abraham did to Hagar was nothing short of sexual abuse. To take somebody for his own gains, to have sex with her, to have his own child, that was rape. And so what he does to this woman, God sees, and he shows that clearly with Hagar. So when God is fulfilling his promise to Abraham, I don't think it's any accident that he chooses to mark the part by which he chose to do harm, to mark himself in a both justice and beautiful redemptive promise. I'm going to still bring my promise true, but you're going to have the part marked of you physically, how I'm going to fulfill that as also a judgment and a fulfillment all in one in this marking, which I found just when I first heard that so compelling and just in line with the God I know. Like this, that's a really beautiful thing. There's also practice that of swearing oaths to one another. That is a cutting of the hand to mark with blood. That was common in Israel's day, both I'm sure in their practice as well as the rest of the world. Egyptian cultures had been practicing a form of circumcision for a time before Israel's asked of it. So there's also a common cultural practice. So there's a number of things that bubble together, but I did love that narrative of God using that part to mark and a sign of his promise towards life-givingness, that we would mark even the part that is passing along that life and where that promise would come through.
I like that.
Especially that it's a costly one.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. And when we saw this question and you shared that with me, I was like, yes, I love that. Yep. And I'm not debating that at all. But the other thought that comes to me as I think about this is in the big picture of God speaking to Abraham and looking much more long-term than that situation, and much more long-term than Abraham could even see. Yeah. Ultimately, you have in the prophetic books in the Old Testament this idea of circumcising your hearts that shifts the focus. It's not just an external circumcision, but that circumcision is supposed to represent an internal change of heart. And then you have that fulfillment in Christ, and then the call to die to self, cut off the sinful nature. And so I also look at the bigger picture of circumcision, and that there is, as part of this Christian life, this cutting off of this spiritual part, not spiritual, cutting off of this non-physical part of us. And when you look at a lot of the Old Testament, it's a physical foreshadowing of a spiritual truth that will be fulfilled in Christ, and then that we walk out. And so I'm like, I also look at the long-term picture and see, like, God knows there's going to be this circumcision of the heart, this cutting off of the sinful nature, this dying to self. All of these terms that we use that are essential to finding the fulfillment of life that's found in Christ, that the Bible makes, in the New Testament, makes abundantly clear. And I'm like, from a purely practical standpoint, there aren't that many parts of the body you can cut off that to kind of foreshadow that that aren't pretty essential.
Much more important
like
daily function.
Yes, exactly. Like, like, I want you to cut off your right hand as this foreshadowing of something. There's a lot of negative connotations and a lot of impact of that, right? A lot of negative consequences, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And so I look at that and I'm thinking, I also think that there's this beautiful, from God point of view, seeing something that nobody in that time would ever have understood, that he's showing a physical foreshadowing of this spiritual truth.
Cutting off of excess is maybe a way to sum it out, right?
Yes, and if you look at the body, there's not a lot of places you could do that that wouldn't have severe consequences.
Totally.
That's fair. I also will just make clear, I know what you emphasized in the Old Testament, but just that was a distinguishing request that God made to his one group of people that was not supposed to continue as widening, which is a very prevalent conversation in the rest of the New Testament, including Galatians that was there. That was not supposed to be something carried on for loyalty to God for all nations who would be drawn back to him. That was one distinct for the Israelite people that sometimes Christians have missed wide swaths of the New Testament and their debate around that to bring that into Christian practice. That was unique to the Israelites in the Old Testament, and Paul especially makes that quite clear in the New, that was no longer a carried forward practice.
And yet, Paul also circumcises Timothy
Yes.
before he allows him to go do ministry with him.
Very much so.
And so there's a whole nother layer there, that the same Paul who writes Galatians and says, what are you doing? You don't need to be circumcised. I wish those who said that you need to be circumcised would go all the way and castrate themselves. Says to Timothy,
hey, by the way,
hey, you want to come on a ministry trip with me? You need to be circumcised. Like, and I'm just going to throw that out there in case somebody wants to add some AER.
There you go.
That's a very interesting thing to see this one person in the New Testament take these two seemingly very diametrically opposed practices or engage in them and seem to be able to reconcile them in his own mind.
Paul's good at that. He does that a lot. Women should stay silent in church. Also, when women prophesy in church, they should have their head covered. Wait, what?
Both in the book of Corinthians.
Both in the same book.
Isn't there a story too, like when you talk about corruption and you think how people misuse things? Is it Jacob's sons that something happens to them and they're mad at another people group? They go and tell those people they need to be circumcised. They get circumcised.
And then they attack them while they're all in pain.
Someone from the other clan rapes one of their sisters.
Right.
And they say, okay, you can come be a part of our family. You just have to be circumcised. They all get circumcised, and while they're recovering, they go slaughter them.
Yeah. It's an awful story.
Yeah.
But if you read the book of Genesis, it is really this, like the story of humanity, as much as it is the story of the origin of the Jewish people. And the God creating a nation out of Abraham is unique to the Jewish people. The humanity element of it is universal.
Yeah. Well, we all see that in every post-apocalyptic fiction, whether it be written or movie or anything. We know once the rules are gone how evil human hearts are. And so we just are barely scraping by because of the fear of a little bit of punishment, that the minute those are gone, we're back to Genesis 1 through 12.
Absolutely. All right. So next question.
Look at us flying through the questions.
We are flying.
2 so far in just a half hour.
2.5.
2.5.
Because we also finished off the...
Okay.
There.
All right. How would you advise parents to talk to their children about baptism? I was baptized with water when I was 10 and realized much later all of the implications of the action. What would you be looking for in a youth-aged person to show they understand and are ready to be baptized in water?
Love this question.
I'll jump in just because I had a perfect moment of conversation with somebody in our church that reflects exactly this. And funny enough, they were specifically asking about their almost 10-year-old to get baptized. Then they were asking, okay, should we let her get baptized, or does she not know enough? And I stopped the dad and I said, let me just pause you there. You don't know enough. He's like, you're a guy, and we have a relationship where I can tell him, like, catch him on guard or off guard, and we were going to be good after that. I said, you don't know enough. I said, I don't know enough. I was reading a book that week that had this beautiful in-depth chapter about baptism that I'm just going, whoa, I didn't see that. I didn't know that. That I don't think there's ever a point for really any of us to catch the full weight of understanding of that moment that we're doing. And we will constantly be growing into. So, with that said, I would be hesitant to apply a specific age of consent where you could know enough, because there would be people who, for a long time in their life, no matter what age, won't know enough. But the aim should then be, can a child, to the best of their abilities, articulate some truth about baptism, because you will always be able to grow into it further and further. It's just, I wanted to relay that conversation to start.
Sure. And I would say, is your child old enough to understand, yes, what being baptized means on a fundamental, basic level?
Yep.
Because yes, we have done it in this church. We haven't done it in a while, but back before COVID, whenever we did baptisms, we also said, is there anyone here who wants to get baptized right now?
Yep.
And sometimes people would get up because they just felt like, yes, I need to do this today. And they didn't always understand the full implications of it. Like if you even just read through some of the New Testament writing about baptism, Paul in the book of Romans, see, unpacks all that this is. Like there's so much about what it represents and what it is that we might not understand.
Yeah.
But at its core, I think if your kid is old enough to make a profession of faith and understand what that means, then you can have that conversation. And I don't know that there's a specific age.
Yeah. I will, again, relay a teaching I heard at one point. Like the day my first child was born, I was equally titled dad as I am now. And I hope now, after 11 years in, I've figured out a lot more ability to do that. And same
That's
with
good.
the
Good
day I
point.
got married,
Good point.
I was called husband and I knew nothing. Like Allie and I look back, I was not even 21 yet. And I was going, I have no idea what I was signing up for at the moment. I've grown into it, right? And I think there's something that refines. And so, yes, there's an age where you want to have enough known, but there's no way until you're on the other side of it, you're going to understand that. And so I think, again, though I change and ebb and flow on the conversation around baptism and what you should know and all that, there is a level of no matter what age, you're always going to grow into it further only once you're on the other side of it.
Yep.
And so you will look back to that moment, and there's a beauty to a young baptism, like a young marriage, where like Allie and I have very deeply been formed by one another because of the youth that we still had, and we were still malleable at those young ages to get married. We have friends that got married in their early and mid 30s, who for them there was a lot more rigidity to having to learn to live with one another.
Different journey.
Yeah, but they much deeper understood what they were stepping into.
Yeah.
Right.
And so there's a beauty to both sides and there's a cost to both sides.
Yep.
So you get married later or you get baptized later, you might have a better understanding. But maybe that's also going to be what keeps you from getting baptized.
Well, I
versus
think
the youthfulness.
I
you're
think
growing to.
we can see that in my experience, anyways. It's not too difficult to encourage a child to be baptized.
Yep.
Right. Especially if they do have an understanding of Jesus, they have an understanding of, salvation.
Yeah.
Then they're like, and you explain to them, if you say, the most general terms I've said before is like, this is actually commanded. Jesus said, get baptized, right? Go and baptize them. So you're a Christian, you should get baptized. Kids will be like, sure.
Yeah.
But if you don't get baptized as a kid and then you get into an adult life, it is a lot tougher conversation to get an adult into the baptismal tank I don't know if it's because they think there's more to it or they don't think they've earned it or whatever else.
Yep.
But there's just way more barriers for an adult to get into the tank than there is for a kid. So I don't know if we should discourage kids too often to get baptized.
Yeah.
If that's something we value, then I think maybe we should just let them get in there.
Yeah.
When there's something like inherently powerful, if you're old enough to understand what you're doing, to making that profession of your faith, that you're planting a flag.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you never plant the flag, it's going to be a different faith journey than if you plant the flag and then you got to wrestle with what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so to not allow your kid who understands what it means on at least some fundamental level to plant that flag may cause them at later points in life to go, well, okay, I'm not really there because I never really planted the flag. And so I think about once we make that decision, right?
Yep.
There's something about that then does change our mindset moving forward, that we have made that commitment and it's real.
Yeah.
And then it does impact our lives, I think, in a healthy way after that.
I think there's a correlation there to how when Israel would have God do something significant, they built an altar in that place to remind them. And every time they go by, it would remind them of that great work. So oftentimes in a place where they probably need something similar, like, okay, that's the God who responds and who provides. There's an anchoring moment that happens in big decisions and commitments. So let's draw again to relationships. Difficult parts of marriage, you look back, no, I made that decision. And that's why I think I don't know what the statistic even would be. Anecdotally, I would go, there's a harder way through once you've gotten married that you're going to fight through more potentially than those people who are just living common law. I don't know if I have the stats to back that, and I don't know.
I've heard that line of thinking.
I've heard that as well.
Right? And so,
I don't know if I couldn't quote anything. But
yeah, and so we made that commitment. All right, well, we're going to hold back to because we had that moment. I think there is something special about that. Then with baptism, okay, I made this commitment. It may be hard. I may have my doubts, but I can look back to that moment as that point in my life. I was confident in this whole God thing at that point, and I don't get it right now. But I made that moment, and I'm going to fight through for that. That there is a beauty, and there's an importance to that. We're creatures of habit and of ritual, that is meaningful to us. And maybe I'm not going to be shy around the word manipulation. Like, sometimes I need that, right? That's why when we're sad, we put on music to amplify that moment or to cheer us up or to pump us up on a run. Like, there are meaningful things that help us push through that I'm not, I guess, shy away from. There's just a practical element to helping somebody in the continuity of their faith that is grounding in that moment, though I think there's much more to it than that.
I don't know if it's manipulation.
I think manipulation gets a bad rap. I don't think it's always a negative term.
I don't know that it is manipulation, but I think there is this point of identity.
Yep.
That I have made that commitment that this is who I am.
Yep.
And I think it's in Atomic Habits that James Clear talks about. The more you identify yourself as something, the easier it will be to maintain that habit.
Yep.
Right? Somebody starts running and they go for a run every day, but they're like, I'm not a runner, I'm not a runner, I'm not a runner.
Yep.
They're going to always struggle with that. But as they run, if they start to go, I am a runner because I run. Yes, I may not be Usain Bolt. I may not be somebody out running, super long races or winning races or whatever, but I am a runner. That identity becomes a core part of who we are.
Yep.
And I think when we make any sort of declaration that this is now who I am, that does have a shaping impact in our lives. We, as a staff, just finished the book, Ordering Your Private World by Gordon MacDonald. And that whole book, going through it again this time, my favorite quote, I think it was in that book, where he talked about we are constantly being formed. Mm-hmm. Every action we take, every decision we make, either is forming us in the right way or malforming us in the wrong way. Yeah. And I remember reading that recently and being like, I've always known that, maybe not always, but I've known this for a while, but it's really resonated with me since then.
Yeah.
And that these actions we take do form us, and they do form a sense of identity of who we are, that if we don't actually do the thing, then we're always like, well, am I a runner or am I not a runner?
Yeah.
Am I a Christian or am I not a Christian? I go to church, but there's something about that identity shaping act. And I think sometimes in the church, separate body and soul and spirit.
Yep.
Not realize it's all together. And that's part of what I love about us doing communion every week at our church. Is there's something about actually taking the emblems and ingesting them as we reflect on and remember that incorporates our body into it, that shapes us in a very real way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I had the privilege to take two young teenage guys out from our church recently talking about baptism with it coming up on Easter Sunday. They're interested in it. I think they're going to wait till another time, but it was just a great conversation. And in a rare moment of wisdom, I started asking them questions to help them bring the ideas forward versus me just telling them, because we had set up the lunch to go talk about baptism, and just started asking what all their ideas about water and the Bible are. And most of the conversation was just fueled by their images. And I tossed in a couple more at the end that I thought maybe they had missed that would be helpful where the conversation had gone. But I think in the part of advising parents to talk about their children about baptism, ask questions about what they think it is. Mm-hmm. And if you can sense their desire and their passion about it, and then you also as a parent, you know where they need some maybe help, or if they've got misunderstandings of, okay, maybe you're not ready for that. I'll, again, share with her own family. Emery, my oldest, was asking to get baptized recently. And for her, I think it was this moment of kind of excitedness. And I didn't want to quash it, but I wanted to ask, okay, where's this coming from? And what does it mean for you to be a follower of Jesus? And for her, there were some things that I felt were lacking. So my challenge to her was, okay, if you want to get baptized, and that's this commitment to following the way of Jesus, let's make sure we know Jesus' words. And my challenge was, we'll get baptized after you read. She's an avid reader. if you read one of the Gospels and we have a conversation about it, read some of what Jesus asks of us, and then if you want to go through. So it was also me knowing her. If we're going to make this commitment, let's, from the way you want to understand it and the way you speak and the way you're wired, let's set a standard to say, this is what I'm committing to. So for her at that age of 10, even if it was a small one, like a barrier of entry, not to keep her away, but to recognize there's a cost to this whole life that's on the other side of that moment too. So that was just one too, that with my own child, how I was talking to her, knowing where she was at, what that jumped into.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. Next question says, I'm not sure if you have answered this question before.
Say we should probably not jump into that one with a little bit of time.
Okay.
Well,
I had thought that. I thought we probably got about 15 minutes.
I don't know if 15 minutes is
Do
fair
you think
enough.
we still have 15 minutes? What time do we start at?
We started a little late, and it's 11:50 now.
Okay.
So, well, you guys call.
No, I'm not saying. I was wondering if we had 15
Let's wait for next week.
I was wondering if we actually had 15 minutes still.
Right. Technically, I believe, yes, we do on the hour of recording.
Cool.
All right. Well, then the next one, yes, we'll do this as our last question today. What image is in your mind when you think of Jesus? Is it there when you pray?
I feel like I've jumped on first, so I'm not going to start this one.
Well, I'm trying to think of what image is in my mind when I think of Jesus.
All right, I'll start if you don't know.
Well,
I'll tell you the correct image to have. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, lead us. In every way, I mean that.
I just had a moment last year, interesting moment, so I can speak to that. Sitting in church on a Sunday morning, listening to the worship team or the band play music. I have had an image of Jesus for a long time as like a Roman centurion soldier. And probably the easiest definition I can say to that is if you've seen the movie Troy, the way Brad Pitt looks. Like whatever he wears, that's my image of Jesus. Right. I probably had the image before that, but when I saw that movie, I was like, oh, that's Jesus.
Right.
But I remember when this happened too. We were doing Revelation, right? So we're walking through Revelation series, and we're talking about Jesus as a slaughtered lamb, and we're talking about all the surrender that is in that book compared to what we might think of the prophecy of Jesus coming as this conquering whatever. And as I'm praying, I guess to answer the second part, I don't always see Jesus when I pray every time or anything like that. But in this moment, I was praying and pondering this, and I just felt like Jesus walked into the scene wearing his armor, and I said out loud, like, why are you wearing that? And he said, because that's what you always put me in. And ever since then, and even in that moment in my vision or whatever I was imagining, Jesus has been in a robe, just a simple robe. So there is definitely a moment of theological rethinking in my brain that was happening in that moment, and I loved his just honesty because that's what you dressed me in.
That's awesome.
When I was a kid, I remember walking into the Christian bookstore, and hanging on a wall was a picture of Jesus laughing. And I'm sure a lot of people have now seen this picture. It became like a pretty famous drawing that someone did. Yeah. And I remember being offended, like maybe a teenager, somewhere in that neighborhood. I remember being like, whoa, timeout. Because I'd never had anyone ever like paint this picture of a laughing Jesus before. My picture of Jesus was of a very stern person who went through life just on the edge of losing it with his stupid disciples. Right? You know the parent who's like, if you guys don't stop, I'm turning this car around in 2 minutes.
More of a Mark Jesus than a John Jesus. Mark is a pretty harsh Jesus in comparison. But I'm
not going to blame any gospel. That was just my picture of Jesus. Right?
Yeah.
It was always that.
Yep.
And I was like, whoa. What are you doing drawing a picture of Jesus laughing? And I remember standing in the store and being like, this second thought of like, maybe that's right. Mm-hmm. And that really shifting my view of Christ. Yeah. And that became the primary image that I had of Jesus when I thought of Jesus for a lot of years. Mm. The only problem with that was it was the sweetest Jesus, right? And then I remember a number of years ago reading the National Geographic article that talked about what did Jesus look like, where they actually like took the DNA of from skeletal remains of people in that time in that place and did like a composite sketch of what Jesus probably looked like.
Yeah.
And it looked nothing like that.
Yep.
And then it became that kind of a merging of the two would be when I picture Jesus, what it is, with a little bit of the guy from The Chosen kind of thrown in there as well. Yeah. If I'm picturing Jesus, and that's why maybe it took a bit for it to come to, because it's kind of an amalgamation of the joy that was in the first picture that I remember and of the accurate ethnicity that was in the second, that kind of merges into this picture of Jesus I have. Because the National Geographic picture of Jesus was, again, a serious person, right? And I don't see Jesus anymore as this constantly somber person. I see him as someone who, as Luke says, full of joy in the Holy Spirit.
I have long struggled with defaulting back to those sometimes Swedish, but sometimes just like model-looking Jesus pictures that we have always had depicted. And there's as I've come to understand art better, like there's this trying to signify his glory through ways that we understand. Like we want to be drawn to him in heart, so we try to make him and depict him in a way that we are drawn to him in all the other physical aspects we look for. And yet there's this conflict with the Bible showing it's this lowliness that he would have exuded that also actually drew him to. I also then heard of the National Geographic one that was done. I really appreciated that one. But I heard of there's this supposedly this church in Israel somewhere, if I remember the story correctly, that has depictions of Jesus from many different countries, not quite every country. That has depictions of him in their native art style and depicted as their native kind of look of whatever their historical background of people would look like. So I really tried to look up a number of those. I've spent a long time looking at this one particular picture of Jesus and the 12 disciples as black people. I've looked at ones in Chinese culture that are pretty old, especially coming from a place where in our culture, as a white male, I'm pretty part of the majority. To look at Jesus and recognize what we would call here in modern tone, minority status that often then brings whatever connotations we'd put into culture and recognize that's from where Jesus led as a minority culture amongst what Rome was doing. That has been really challenging to me of this is the Jesus I pray to and recognizing what he's calling me to join him in. So that's been hard, but I catch myself all the time in prayer. If I do have an image in my head, going back to that majority white Swedish Jesus, attractive Jesus versus how he lived, even in just what his ministry was, and those challenging pictures to me to get to the heart of Jesus, even if they're not historically accurate Jesus. I know Jesus was not Chinese, but there's something valuable about seeing him in that picture. I know Jesus was probably not black, but seeing him in that, it just challenges my heart to catch who he was more than a historical accuracy. So those have been helpful ones, and also pictures of slain lamb. I know Jesus was not an animal, but there's been something that draws me to that as I pray to that Jesus to recognize what he is and who I'm speaking with.
I've seen the pictures that you're talking about of Jesus in different, from different cultures, different races. I love them. I've always loved them. And it's boggled my mind when white people have been upset by them who don't realize their Jesus is from Sweden.
Correct.
Like we say Swedish Jesus intentionally because
Everybody
he
knows
looks
that.
like he's from Sweden. Like even if you go back to some of the older depictions of like movies of Jesus, right? You would have a bunch of Middle Eastern people, and then Jesus was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person.
Totally.
And we're totally good with that because that's us. But somebody else wants to do the same thing, wants to be able to relate to Christ in a way that is them, and we have a problem with it. And we're blind to the fact that we do the same thing. So I remember seeing those pictures and be like, that is so beautiful. That is, like, I loved that.
There's something so theologically true with those. Of like, I see me in Jesus and Jesus in me in that. And so, yes, for the majority of it, we've got European Jesuses because European culture has been so dominant within the world for the last number of hundreds of years. So they carry
And Christendom dominantly European.
and so they carry their Jesus with them,
Yep.
which I understand. But the truth of Jesus' incarnation is found in those pictures so deeply and so
Yes.
beautifully, because it's saying we are all in Jesus,
Yeah.
and Jesus is with, not just in our depictions of him, he is quite with us in our cultures and in our expressions. There's something so theologically true about those pictures to me as I've come across them. And then again, challenging to us, we want to put Jesus in the dominant culture, and yet that was never where he put himself.
Totally.
And so to see that also is a challenge. I think there is something true to those people that get upset about those pictures because they're like, well, no. Jesus should be, without them being able to say it or even articulate it, Jesus should be a part of the strongest. That's not the picture that Jesus
I don't
paints
know
of
if it's
himself.
that it's sort of part of the strongest, though, but that he looks like me.
Well, I think that's what we all
Right.
are doing, right? We all see ourselves as the in group and the important group. So to see Jesus as me and correlating that with our modern cultures, to see Jesus outside of that, I think I'm trying to understand what's going on psychologically, even if those people aren't seeing it in the moment. And that's the Jesus I've always seen depicted, so I like it how I've always seen it.
Yes,
It's also
100%.
happening there, right? A familiarity.
Even if I don't like it,
Yeah.
seeing a different picture is new, and
Yeah.
sometimes I just don't like the new.
I don't like new.
But there's another part of this question we got to get to before we're out of time,
Sure.
which is it there when you pray?
I hit that as sometimes I do, and sometimes my mind drifts back to the Eurasian Jesus, European Jesus, sorry. That I try to recorrect that in my own mind, but it prone to wander back to familiarity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for me, less than years ago, personal journey over the last number of years has been much more of praying to the Father. Just I had this moment. I don't know if I was reading the Lord's Prayer. I don't know what it was, but Jesus teaching the disciples to pray, Our Father. And I realized how for the majority of my life I had prayed to Christ. And I'm not saying you can't pray to Christ in any way. Please don't hear that. But it just sparked this thing in me where in my personal prayer life, there has been this intentionality of praying to the Father as a discipline that I have been really trying to lean into for the last number of years. And the reason for that is because the church context I grew up in, it was easy to pray to Jesus. Jesus was the friendly older brother who was constantly talking to angry Heavenly Father
Right.
about, just don't smite them.
Yeah.
Like, remember I died for them, don't smite them.
Yeah.
And that was the church. That was where I got from the church context. I'm not blaming the church context. That's what I got was God the Father was, again, always this on the verge of losing it.
Yeah.
And Jesus is the one ever interceding on our behalf. And so he's like the one sitting in the passenger seat, in the front seat, being like, it's okay. It's okay. Like, I died for this too.
Have you heard of the thin blue line for police officers? The thin blue line who keeps chaos from exuding into the rest of culture and to the rest of the world? It's almost like Jesus is the thin red line. Like, God, just let it.
Yes, and so I had this really distorted view of the Father and this moment of realizing that. And so I have been intentionally focused on praying to the Father and trying to allow him to reshape my image of him into something that's more true.
Cool.
Yeah, I'd say I have the same journey in some way. I took a course, I think it was spiritual formation at Ambrose, and the prof was Peter Ralph, and he was like very diligent in the theologically correct way to pray and to worship. Like the whole thing was on how to worship, but and I don't know that I'd be dogmatic on that. I think people can pray any way they want. God is a very gracious and awesome God.
I think the Psalms teach us that our prayers don't have to always be theologically accurate.
Yes, but he was diligent on the fact that Jesus said we pray to the Father. So we pray to the Father through Jesus Christ by the Holy Spirit. That was always his thing. So
Yep.
But anyways, I think that's it for today. So thanks for joining us in this episode of Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. We are excited that you are here. We love answering your questions, so please check out invertedorthodoxy.com where you can submit your questions, and then we can answer them and keep going on this journey. And when you listen to our podcast, please rate and review us, and we will see you guys next week.
That was the best ending you've ever done.